Welcome back to Joe's Stunner Boxing. I hope you're doing well. The sun is shining, coming through the blinds, blinding me. Anyway, first world problems, what can I tell you? Anyway, all this talk about, failed drug tests and PEDs and all this sort of stuff, it got me thinking, it didn't used to be like this in the old days, did it? I mean, I'm in my mid-50s now, so I can remember boxing as far back as the 80s. Probably the late 70s was when I really got into it, even though I didn't really know what I was watching at that time. But failed drug tests, I mean, what's all that about? And then it suddenly dawned on me, when I was thinking, like, who was the first PED abuser or steroid monster who I'd heard of? And then it suddenly hit me, Bob Hazleton. Now, that name might not mean much to you, but he's a very, very famous example of an early steroid user, abuser, however you want to phrase it. And it gave him short-term success, moderate success, but long-term it absolutely destroyed his life. And let me tell you a little bit about Bob Hazleton then. So he was a fighter who, I don't think he ever weighed more than sort of modern cruiserweight limit, but he fought an awful lot of heavyweights. Journeyman guy, lost his first 4 fights, all by knockout. And in fact, in his first 13 fights, I think he'd only won 4. He'd lost 9, and all 9 were by knockout. But just as an aside, one of those defeats, those knockout defeats, was a first round bludgeoning by someone called George Foreman, who at the time was 10 wins and no defeats. So Foreman was on the way up, and Bob Hazleton was just fodder for him. But Hazleton basically couldn't fight, okay? And he was fighting average opposition, and like I say, his first 13 fights, 9 defeats, all by knockout. Now, around 1971, he started to take these pills, and he started to get into what we now call PEDs, steroids essentially. And not many people knew much about them, but what he did discover is suddenly he was bulking up, he was putting on weight, he felt physically strong, his stamina was better, and he then went on a tear-up. Even though he did lose a couple of fights, he went on an undefeated string of 10 fights. And guess what? Even though they were against very modest opposition, he won them all by knockout. And he's thinking, this is this like miracle drug I'm taking. What the hell is this? This is brilliant. I don't know what it is, but I'll take it. Now, he did pick up the odd defeat. For example, he fought Bob Foster, the great light heavyweight champion, and lost in 10 rounds. Not in the first round, as he had been, but in 10 rounds. That was in 1977. So he'd been taking steroids for about 5, 6, 7 years, maybe. But even then, he couldn't get past Bob Foster. No problem. He carried on picking up wins against, again, very, very poor opposition. And he won another 5 fights. I think they were all by knockout. He then lost in 3 rounds to Lucian Rodriguez, who was a pretty good heavyweight back in the day, fringe contender. But what I should say is he had a rematch with Bob Foster, and this was in 1978. And he knocked him out in 2 rounds. He knocked out the great Bob Foster in 2 rounds. Foster was, a light heavyweight, as we know. But the idea that Bob Hazleton has a 2-round knockout win against Bob Foster is kind of remarkable. And in fact, the second round of that fight was incredible, because Foster was down 3 times and Hazleton was down twice. They were just knocking each other over. And then the fight, I think, was stopped between the second and the third round. Foster's corner pulled him out. Anyway, after that, like I say, he lost to Lucian Rodriguez, and then I think he only fought once more after that, and scored I can't remember the guy's name, was a debutant. He knocked him out in a couple of rounds. So he ended up, then he finished his career, his boxing career, 20 wins with 18 KOs, all courtesy of steroids. 11 defeats, all by knockout. Every single one was by knockout. He was a big lad. I mean, he didn't weigh that much, but he was, 6'7", 6'8", that sort of thing. He looked the part, which is probably why he still got work, even though he couldn't fight at all. But after retiring from boxing, he then went into bodybuilding, and I think he was a wrestler as well. I believe so. And he had, a pretty decent. He made a living. He had a pretty decent bodybuilding career, I guess. I think he was into, I don't know whether it was wrestling, it might have been weightlifting. I'm thinking it begins with a W, weightlifting or wrestling. I think it might have been weightlifting, actually, come to think of it. But anyway, this didn't last because the steroids suddenly took their toll on him. And doctors believe that a lot of these steroids contained estrogen, lots of it, or a female hormone, probably estrogen, if not then very similar, which caused something called phlebitis. And phlebitis is an inflammation of the veins, and it affects the blood flow to the legs. And Bob Hazleton had this bad. In fact, he had it so bad and so irreversible that he ended up having both his legs amputated. He also suffered, I believe, 2 or 3 heart attacks, and essentially he had the body and the constitution of a 90-year-old man when he was in his 40s and 50s. In other words, he destroyed his body. Now, when it came to light exactly what was in what he'd been taking, he then went on a sort of crusade, if you like, understandably so. Spoke at high schools about the dangers, to high school jocks and all this, about the dangers of taking steroids. And it became, whatever time he had left, he was going to use it to try and, he couldn't save himself, but maybe save a few other people from going down the same avenue. But unfortunately, he died at the age of 67, which, to be honest, is more than you might have thought he would last, considering the way he'd abused his body. But that's Bob Hazleton for you. As far as I know, certainly in my lifetime, the first guy I ever read about who was essentially a PED cheat. And I don't even know if all these steroids were illegal at the time. They may not have been. I don't know. But yeah, a manufactured record against very, very poor opposition in boxing. Apart from that amazing two-round knockout against Bob Foster, he was knocked out by also-rans frequently. He had the bodybuilding career, and like I said, I think it was weightlifting, not wrestling. Weightlifting, I think. He had a bit of a career there, but he paid the ultimate price. And of course, PEDs, steroid use, is now so much more advanced, so much more sophisticated. But let's not be under any illusions. If you put stuff in your body that doesn't belong there, if you put mind-altering substances into your body of any sort, it's not going to do you any good long term. Certainly not if you do it excessively. Or maybe not excessively, but if you do it consistently, it isn't good for you. It really isn't. So maybe there's a lesson to be learnt there. Don't think that because we are now at a point where everything is nice and sophisticated that, and that cycles can be, you can be cycled off, and, I mean, I deal with drug addicts, but we do get a lot of steroid users using the needle exchange. I don't know much about steroids, about the composition of it, the chemistry or anything, but I deal with more the sort of harm minimisation stuff, vary your sites, keep them clean, be careful you don't, I mean, it's a muscular thing, steroids. It's not like if you're a heroin addict and you go through your veins or whatever. But make no mistake about it, it can damage you. It can damage you. So yeah, that's Bob Hazleton for you. I won't go into a preachy rant. Or have I just done that? I don't know. But yeah, Bob Hazleton, look him up. Interesting case. Just thought I'd mention that. The patron saint or the godfather of steroid users, steroid monsters. It's a shame what happened to him, but people should learn from his mistakes, I think. Comments below if you've got any. Thank you for your time as always. Subscribe to the channel if you're new, and of course hit the like button, that helps us out, and spread the word about Joe Stunner Boxing. I always appreciate your time. Thanks a lot, lads. Bye for now.